if you went to a parish church on any given Sunday in England in, say, the 15th century. You would have walked into a church and you would have seen a gathering of people that was enormously interested in worshipping God in the best way that they possibly could. This was an era where civic guilds would come together to sponsor altars in churches and to decorate them beautifully. Things like rood screens, these magnificent things that sadly were mainly smashed up during the Reformation and during the Republic in England, those that survive show a testament to just how vital the church was in England in the later Middle Ages. Confraternities, for example, would come together under the protection of a saint, and they would do pilgrimages, they would do processions, they would hold services where they all got together and sang, for example. This doesn't seem really like a moribund church if you genuinely look into it. Now, it had been the case that some of the older orders, the Augustinians, for example, or the Benedictines, were seeing fewer bequests, less money being given to them by people. But the more mystical orders and the orders that went out and preached, for example, the Brigittines at Sion Abbey and other orders were being given bequests by people who wanted these monks, nuns, these religious people to pray for their souls. The monasteries were the engine of prayer that kept the English church humming. Professions to the religious life increased in the years leading up to the dissolution. And so the idea that the monastic tradition was moribund in England is likewise a myth that needs to be exploded. So overall, when you look at the medieval English church, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, a much more nuanced picture emerges than that which has been commonly put about. Now, there have been a number of reasons why, for example, that false picture of what happened in the late medieval English church has been put about. The reformers in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in the 17th century, when the Puritans come to the fore, they wanted to show the justness and righteousness of their cause by painting the blackest possible picture of what had gone on in the Middle Ages. It was moribund, it was superstitious, it just had to be reformed. The other reasons that the late medieval English church has been painted as moribund, as superstitious, is for confessional reasons. When the Reformation, or I should say Reformations, plural, come to England, there is the idea that there were enormities, to use Cranmer's language, for example, perpetrated by the medieval English church. The idea that doctrine had evolved beyond what could be proved by Scripture. And so, if the doctrine, if practice in the Middle Ages had evolved beyond what could be proved by Scripture, then that scriptural sort of baby needed to be preserved, and the awful bathwater needed to be chucked out. Well, of course, the issue for the reformers is that quite a lot of medieval doctrine comes into the Reformed Anglican Church. Not that any one of the reformers would ever really admit that. So, the idea of this moribund, of this unfaithful, of this superstitious church essentially existed until, I should say, just about the 1980s. Several scholars, Dermot MacCulloch, for example, or Eamon Duffy, have gone back, taken another look at the evidence, And although some of the conclusions that they have come to are very different, but the evidence is there that the English church in the later Middle Ages was much more vibrant, much more faithful than has been historically portrayed. When you talk about the Church of England online, you will inevitably get a comment back saying something along the lines of, "Your church was only started because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife and marry Anne Boleyn." That's just simply not the case. It's very important to understand Henry VIII, his reign, and the changes that the church went through under his reign in their wider social, political, diplomatic, historical context. And if you don't understand the history, if you don't understand what was going on the continent at the time, you definitely don't understand the beginnings of the English Reformation. So, what was actually going on? Henry came to the throne in 1509 on the death of his father. Henry was not the eldest child of his house. He had an older brother called Arthur, who was married very briefly to Catherine of Aragon. Arthur died 5 months after that marriage. It is very unlikely that the marriage was ever consummated, although Arthur, like any other 15-year-old boy, boasted that he had spent his wedding night in Spain. Henry VIII would later use this as an argument to say that because his brother's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been consummated, that Catherine could not have married him. Henry comes to the throne in 1509 as a relatively young man. He was only about 18. Around this time, probably about 4 years later, a number of other continental monarchs come to the throne. The Emperor Charles V and Francis I of France. So, the continent and England were ruled by young men. When he came to the throne, the first thing that Henry VIII wanted was a war, preferably with France, but there was a peace treaty in force at that time, and so Henry had to wait until 1512 when he won the magnificent Battle of the Spurs, paintings of which you can still see in Hampton Court. Henry VIII also wanted another kind of war, a crusade against the Turks. He and his chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, worked from 1518 to 1521 to put together a universal peace between all of the warring kingdoms of Europe, preparatory, they said, to a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, which was even then steamrollering up through the Balkans. They got their universal peace in the 1518 Treaty of London, and Wolsey briefly looked like he could have been Pope. It's one of the sad byways of history that Wolsey was not, in fact, made the Pope. But in 1521, Henry also wrote and published the assertion or the defense of the 7 sacraments against Martin Luther. Henry VIII despised Martin Luther, not only because of his theological stances, but also because Martin Luther was fomenting what Henry thought of as civil rebellion within the Holy Roman Empire. So, when Henry VIII defended the papacy and the church against Luther, he also felt that he was defending England, his realm, against sedition and privy conspiracy. Martin Luther's writings were banned in England, and the assertion of the 7 sacraments was widely printed and distributed all across the continent. And in consequence of this book, some say Thomas More helped him, though it's disputed. Thomas More swore up and down that he never helped Henry with the book. But when the book did come out, the Pope